Introduce you to Jan Dillenschneider.
Thank you all for coming. It's a special evening, quite a big crowd here. This is put on by the Dillenschneider Group. My husband, Robert Dillenschneider, foresaw the need for civility in America, which we all know at this stage of life, it is totally necessary. The Hearst Media Group has been a really big supporter, and they're wonderful. And Alice Knapp, who's president of the Ferguson Library, is a dynamic person who's, as it is said, the center of the city. It is my honor tonight to introduce General David Petraeus, and I'm quoting, "The most prominent U.S. military figure in post-9/11 era has been described as one of great battle captains." I think that sounds very exciting, of American military history. We all know his name, and tonight we're going to have a little bit different format. It's going to be a Q&A, and the gentleman who is going to be questioning is John Brunick. You probably have all read him in the Hearst papers. He's editorial page editor and columnist of the Stanford Advocate and the Greenwich Times. So I'm going to immediately turn this over to the two gentlemen. Thank you.
Since I got to the microphone first.
You opened your water first.
I opened my water first, too. Let me thank Jan and also your husband, who is back there somewhere, for the contributions that you have made to this community overall, but also especially for this library. As a youngster who grew up 3 blocks from a library and whose mother was a part-time librarian and surrounded by many, many books, one of those families that never throws anything out. I really feel pleased to do this event here in an asset to this community that really is extraordinary. So thanks for what you and Robert, Bob have done for this community. Great. Thank you. Not yet, John. I want to thank you also for doing this. Thanks for what you do in the Fourth Estate. A huge believer in freedom of speech and freedom of the press, even when it is used to criticize me. And we can talk about the New York Times full-page ad that I opened up to one morning when I was about to do the biggest testimony of my life on Capitol Hill. And thanks for agreeing to do it without enhanced interrogation techniques. I have opposed those since the very beginning. Thanks to all of you for being here as well. I realize that this beats sitting at home and counting up how much your 401k has lost in the last 2 weeks. Who knows if this is the last of these that you're able to go to for a while. But it really is a pleasure to do this, even if it's a little bit mystifying why one of America's great battle captains, your quote, not mine, is here to talk about civility in public service.
Well, we are here as part of the Civility in America series. I know my 8-year-old son, who some of the people here know, would treat me in a very uncivil manner if I didn't open by thanking you for your service.
And it was a privilege. Thank you.
Now this series, and I see a lot of faces who've been here before, I've been here to see, this room filled for Beach Boy Mike Love and New York Yankees general manager Brian Cashman, Bishop Caggiano. Jan could probably fill in some blanks for me. And, this was sold out in advance, but obviously who knew what to expect with coronavirus? But good for everybody who came out for this. And I know one of your events was canceled yesterday.
One went. We did the one at Mount Vernon last night down in Virginia, but the Brookings event was canceled. I think we were going to do it on C-SPAN, but there was an issue with that.
So, as somebody whose career has been built around, or you've wrapped your mind around building strategies, what are your thoughts on strategies regarding coronavirus that are working and ones that we should be doing?
Well, thanks for starting with an easy one. Look, I think we are starting to do now what I think some will look back on this and certainly ask whether we might have started a bit sooner, whether there might have been some preparation of our health system overall, the guidance overall, and certainly the procurement of a lot of the items that ended up in short supply some 6 weeks after we really had a sense that this was coming soon to a theater near us. I think that now is starting to get into train. Certainly there are variations from state to state. It's interesting to watch governors that are really aggressive on this. We saw, for example, in New York State today, they have literally sequestered the Guard, National Guard has been called out and so forth. And I think it requires that kind of bold action to try to contain this. That at least seems to be the lesson from China. It seems to be the lesson from South Korea, where, again, they were a bit late in starting, but once they got going, we'll see how it turns out in Italy and a number of other countries. I have actually been focused, so keep in mind that, I've come to realize in my post-government life that the highest form of service is the private equity industry. People in Stanford will appreciate that, I'm sure, at least many of those in the room tonight. We've been focused a good bit on, obviously, on the financial and economic implications of this. And I should note, so I am a partner in KKR. I've been with the firm for about 7 years now, the chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which does the geopolitical risk and then integrates the macroeconomic analysis and the environmental social governance issues analysis as we're looking at investments around the world. Then we help the firms in which we invest. Once we've done that, we own about 100 companies, full ownership around the world, and we have minority investments in another 100 or so. And then we obviously try to help our investors understand the world in which we're investing together. It's actually hugely stimulating. I enjoy it fully. I think when you reach the stage in life I'm at, what you really want is intellectual stimulation. It's why I've continued to do a variety of academic endeavors. I don't want to read part of the bio that some of you may remember. I had a strange military career that had some detours at Princeton and teaching economics and international relations, and managed to survive all that and still have some success as an infantry officer. But so we're looking at the economic implications, and actually have had conversations with folks at pretty high levels in the White House last week, and some others on Capitol Hill and so forth. And our concern has been that to make sure that the folks who are in policymaking positions and in the legislation positions recognize that this is a really different situation from certainly the Great Recession. That was a real financial crisis. This is not a financial crisis. This is a fear crisis. It is a medical health emergency. And it happens at a time when we have an enormous increase over any other period of downturn. Keep in mind, we haven't really had a downturn for over 10 years or so. This is the longest expansion in our history. But we now have something called gig economy workers, perma-temps, huge numbers of contractors, sharing economy workers. So beyond the industries that are in the travel, tourism, hospitality, and now energy, because that's the double whammy now that there's a huge spat between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and they're not going to control supply, so energy prices have just plummeted from some mid-60s down to mid-30s per barrel in a 2-week period, which is a dramatic reduction. So you have that added to this other concern, but you have a totally different economy. Again, and these individuals that I've just mentioned in such vast numbers were not around for the last downturn. And it seems to us the big ideas, and I'll keep coming back to the term of big ideas, the big ideas here need to be to make sure that they don't lose their house and lose their car and don't starve. Now, why do I say that? Because they don't have unemployment insurance. They don't have food stamp availability in many cases. They certainly don't have 14 days of paid sick leave. All the different programs, the social safety nets that are there for people who are carrying full-time jobs, I think are called W-2 jobs or what have you, are not necessarily available for all of them. It varies from state to state. Same when it comes to health insurance in a number of cases. So the focus should be on what we're going to do for them. Indeed, as we also look at what we're going to do for the airliners that now are, on the verge of a real serious downturn. Again, if you don't be good time to be in the cruise ship business. But a host of these others. I mean, New York, which I just drove up from, is not quite a ghost town, but we sure made it up here quicker than any other time I've ever tried to come up to Stanford or Greenwich or these other places. So, and that's before the real impact is felt. And so our hope is indeed that result of the president being on Capitol Hill today, a variety of other initiatives that are going on behind the scenes, that those are the areas of focus so that you expand access to unemployment, expand access to paid sick leave, expand access to food stamps, or something also called TAMP, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. All of these kind of programs that might not be there for, again, the permatemps, the contractors, the gig economy workers, sharing economy workers, and so forth. But our country's going to have to figure this out because we have never gone through a really serious downturn with this complexion to our economy and to our workforce. And that's why we tend to view that as preferable to, say, a payroll tax reduction or cut or what have you. I mean, first of all, who gets that? It's people who get a payroll. And the bigger the payroll, the better, not necessarily who we need to look after. So that has been a good bit of our focus. I think the medical side of it now, we're starting to catch up. Again, as I said, people will look back and ask whether we might not have made better use of the time since January or whenever, when it was pretty obvious that this was going to spread. But that can be saved for the after-action review. The focus now should be, as I said, making sure that people can stay in their house, their car, and get food on the table.
Curious, as we address the banner idea of civility, given your experience, are there measures of civility during wartime?
Well, first of all, yes, and we tried to adhere to them. It's called the Geneva Convention,
right.
The Law of Land Warfare, as one. So we used to say, I mean, however barbaric the enemy we're facing may be, and it was very barbaric, and is very barbaric when you think of the images that the Islamic State sent back of people literally being burned alive in a cage in an orange jumpsuit and all the rest of this. So again, certainly that is your enemy. In some cases, you have to kill your enemy before he kills you. But again, it still should observe certain norms of the battlefield that generally have to do with proportionality and a degree of avoiding, obviously, collateral damage and all the rest of that. And our rules of engagement are designed to reinforce that. Beyond that, I always thought there's a reasonable cause. The golden rule is a pretty good basic principle. Allowing people to have dignity and respect. I mean, there are some folks out there that would say, boy, I don't think Petraeus ever fired anybody. I fired a lot of people. This was combat. This was deadly serious. And if it was very clear that someone was not measuring up or was not able to carry out his or her responsibility, there was no question that that person was going to leave. That doesn't mean you have to do a public execution. I was not somebody who, got enjoyment out of terminating someone's assignment or perhaps career, if that's what it came to it. And we did not hesitate to make those tough calls. But that doesn't mean that you have to destroy someone individually and that you can't at least try to have the individual retain, again, his or her dignity and respect, even when you're making very, very tough personnel choices, but you have to do that. So again, it seemed to me that that was a reasonable approach. And, it's not to say that, there weren't times when I got exercised was the term that I used to use. But again, you try to avoid that, except when you're acting. And there were actually times, no kidding, I would go into meetings, and of course we often did meetings, I had a translator with me. It happened to be an individual who was with me for something like 6 years overall, and he's still a very close advisor and confidant. Of course, he was a New York City taxi driver, and he'd learned the interpersonal skills in the streets of New York. He's actually an incredibly entrepreneurial Jordanian Palestinian, the first Jordanian to dunk a basketball. He was the Michael Jordan of Jordan. He'd scored, no kidding, he'd scored 60 some odd points personally in a 4 double or 4-time overtime game, the first time that Jordan beat Syria. He's a national hero, but then, of course, came to the United States and again, obviously ended up in New York. And so he came back over and joined us very early on. I was the commander of the 101st Airborne Division for the fight to Baghdad, 2-star general. And then we suddenly were ordered north to Mosul, a very, very challenging area, very ethnically and diverse and diverse in sects as well, religious sects. He joined us up there, was invaluable. And every time I had a tour there, which totaled over time 4 total years on the ground there, and then we went with me to Central Command at the whole region, he was at my side. But we would go into a meeting, and I would say, okay, Saudi, and if the ambassador was with us, I'd give them a warning that this was going to be a full range of emotions meeting. That meant that I was going to lose it, because they occasionally needed to know that I was as emotional about this as they were. And there are a lot of emotions in that culture. And occasionally I had to show that I was very serious about this. But the rule was that you just let me go unless you think I'm actually losing it. And you can actually, these are serious issues, and you are seriously frustrated, and there are people really fighting and dying as a result of what's going on, and you need to convey that at times. But you can't lose control, because if you do, what could happen is what we call something that is non-biodegradable. It never goes away. A statement or an insult or an action that, again, just completely severs the relationship that you work very hard to build with, say, the prime minister of a country or president of a country or what have you. I would add, by the way, that Abu Ghraib was a non-biodegradable event. Those pictures are there online forever. There's a little bit of a half-life to them, but they are going to haunt us again for the rest of our lives. So you do need to show this, but the point was, don't pluck my sleeve unless you think I'm no longer acting, because you cannot lose control. If you do, you often will do something that you'll regret later on.
You built a reputation for building allies in the United States and certainly overseas.
Allies matter. Remember,
Allies matter.
Winston Churchill said the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And he was right. Look, I commanded the biggest combat coalition, all in combat, not just in name or on paper or something like that, but in Afghanistan. We had over 60 countries actually on the ground with soldiers fighting. And it took an enormous amount of effort. We called it coalition maintenance. And I realized one time, here I was meeting with a particular prime minister and a head of government, his minister of defense, minister of foreign affairs, chief of defense staff, a bunch of others. And I was giving him more minutes of my time than he was giving soldiers to the coalition. I said, there's something wrong with this math. But, that's what you do. And you spend a great deal of time. The truth is that in any military coalition these days, there's only one country that has no caveats, that has no restrictions on its forces, and that is the United States. And frankly, every other contingent, including over time the UK, had some restrictions. We discovered that. We were going to move British soldiers 3 villages over down in southwestern Afghanistan. The next thing you know, Prime Minister Cameron is out there trying to discover what it is we have in mind, and we ultimately do not do it. So the U.S. then ends up in a lot of ways compensating for the capability shortcomings and all the rest of that for the others. But that's okay. Again, get over it. We are engaged in these alliances because they are not just for the greater good, they are for our good as well.
We were chatting outside, and I think this will resonate with some people in this audience as well. You've recently worked with Joe Lieberman, who was born and raised just a few blocks from here. Can you tell us about that relationship, the history of it, and what you're doing together now?
Well, gosh, I mean, I didn't just start working with Joe Lieberman recently.
Yeah.
I mean, Joe Lieberman, in my view, is a hero. He is a truly extraordinary American. He is, by the way, talk about somebody who treats people with dignity and respect. He is the epitome of that. He's also a brilliant individual. He's a determined one. He has a nice air about him. He's always jovial
Affable
and congenial and all the rest of this. But deep down, he is absolutely, there's a steel rod up his back. I don't need to remind people of this state that he lost the primary of his own party for Senate, and he went ahead and ran as an independent and won. That is pretty impressive. A lot of that was because, in fact, he was supporting the enterprise in which I was engaged, Iraq. And when push really came to shove, when President Bush made this very courageous decision that instead of throwing in the towel, he was going to conduct a surge and he was going to have a new general and a new ambassador, there were 3 individuals in the Senate who really hung tough with us for that first 6 or 8 months before it was very clear that the surge was really working. And we called them the 3 amigos. It was Senators McCain, Lieberman, and Graham. And I cannot say enough about all 3 of them. I might add, I was very privileged to give one of the 4 eulogies at the personal service for the real funeral service for Senator McCain at Annapolis, not the one shown on television. Lindsey Graham was one of the others, and his son also. These were really extraordinary individuals at a time when the rest of the Congress was going sideways. Remember that in 2006, 2 months before the surge, the Republicans had lost control of the Congress. So the situation when I was nominated to command the surge in very early January, I went up on Capitol Hill. I knew Senator McConnell really well because he, part of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, obviously, is in his home state. He was the majority leader until that election. Now he was the minority leader. And he sat me in a room and he paraded through one after another these very senior disgruntled Republican senators. And I just got an earful all day long. And this is my introduction to support for the war on Capitol Hill. Obviously, the confirmation hearing did turn out very well. But we were essentially given 6 months. And I knew that we were staring this in the face. We had to have results in 6 months. When I agreed that I would come back and do a public testimony at 6 months. I then persuaded the ambassador to come with me, even though it meant we each had to do 2 additional committees. But that was a very, very tough period. And I told the Senate Armed Services Committee during my confirmation hearing that it was going to get much worse before it got better. And again, during this period, there were 3 people that truly were absolutely steadfast behind us. And again, those were the 3 amigos. And during that whole period, remember that was about 19 and a half months. I did another 19 months at U.S. Central Command over the whole theater, including Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the others. We were very proud. It had 90% of the world's problems at the time. It also had 90% of the world's deployed special operations forces. And then, of course, took command in Afghanistan as well. And I mean, they were always there. Every 4th of July, they were not back home. They were out there with us. I remember July 4th, 2008. By then, everybody acknowledged, even the fiercest critics of the surge couldn't argue. You know, when violence is down by 80%, it's sort of hard to argue with results. In fact, I should note, as an aside, my father was a Dutch sea captain who came to the United States when the Nazis overran Holland in 1940. His ship had nowhere else to go. They put into Brooklyn Navy Yard, signed up with the U.S. Merchant Marine. They had a very long war and the highest per capita casualties in the war. But again, Dutchmen tend to be stubborn. My mother thought they could be a bit blockheaded as well, and a few other things. But you know, he would look me in the eye when I'd come home and say, you know, here's what happened. He'd say, "Results, boy, results," and that was what that was the deal in Iraq. In fact, I remember General Keane coming out, one of my greatest mentors, by the way, was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom today, and he was no longer in service, but he kept coming out. He was the one person in the Oval Office with President Bush with 4 or 5 other generals who said we should surge, Mr. President, and you should put this guy in charge. By the way, he was standing next to me at an earlier time when I got shot. I mean, we have a long history together. But he came out about 3 or 4 months into the surge, and he said, Dave, you got a bit of a public relations problem. I mean, you got to start getting the word out. I said, boss, we don't have a public relations problem. We have a results problem. And once the results are indisputably better, and we think they are now, it's happening, but give us a little time. Once the results are better, the public relations problem will go away, and it did. But in July of 2008, here's McCain, Lieberman, and Graham, and we had the biggest re-enlistment ceremony in military history. 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, all with their right hand in the air, reciting the oath, and I was the enlistment officer, so they were reciting it after me. And it was truly an extraordinary event in a combat zone, having the biggest, just think of the logistics of flying all these people in, and the irony of this is that it was inside one of the domes of a palace that Saddam used to use. Even the New York Times had to put that on the front page above the fold. It was quite a picture. But I always thought how wonderful it was that McCain, Lieberman, and Graham were there to share that event, because they had so much to do with the support when we most needed it. So again, I have enormous, now we've done lots of other stuff since then. He's on the Institute of the Study of War Board, United Against Iran, and a variety of other very worthy causes. He's also one of those individuals who will say yes when you ask him to do something, even if it requires time and effort. And so again, I think the absolute world of him. And I am proud, I think, to count him as a friend as well as a great American.
There's another little bit of local history I was interested in hearing from you about. Some people in this room may know James Sparrow from Stanford. He was a U.S. Marine in Vietnam, and he later led a grassroots effort that sued chemical companies that produced Agent Orange. I think in 1982, it eventually led to the group being awarded $240 million for people who suffered the effects of Agent Orange. Now, there are parallels to some of your outreach regarding burn pits. I mentioned this to you, and you had said, well, I don't know how many people know about this, but 40 years ago, people couldn't wrap their heads around Agent Orange either.
Well, the issue here, it has become topical again because we're very concerned. So I'm also in a bunch of veterans organizations. I think it's over a dozen, but we have an agreement. I don't go to board meetings. Just tell me what you need me to do, and I'll do it. And what the Iraq-Afghanistan Veterans of America is a very important one to me. They needed me to work to convince Congress to pass something called the Burn Pits Act, and we got it into legislation this past year. It's essentially to require the collection of data on soldiers who are still in uniform, even as the Veterans Administration is doing the same thing with veterans who spend a lot of time, frankly, downwind from burn pits. I'm one of them, by the way. I certainly don't think I'm showing any ill effects yet, but we're very concerned that burn pit smoke and the residue that was in it, because everything was thrown into these. I mean, you might ask, well, why don't you take it to the dump or the Mount Trashmore or something like that? Well, I mean, those didn't exist in these places. Besides that, if you had to do that, it would have been a combat operation. And so inevitably in these huge bases, I mean, we had bases that had as many as 30 or 40,000 people on them. In fact, one of those is where my part-time headquarters was. And on a bad wind day, I mean, you're just sucking this stuff in, and there's not much you can do about it. And everything was thrown in there, including some things that probably shouldn't have been thrown in there. So we're concerned about the effects of that, because there are reports now of veterans who experience that, who are starting to exhibit some of the kinds of signs of what may, I think now indisputably, was caused by Agent Orange. And I have personal experience here. My father-in-law, who rose to 4 stars, but had 2 years down in Vietnam, including a tour in the Delta, where they used a lot of Agent Orange to eliminate the foliage under which the Viet Cong were hiding, had Parkinson's and passed away from that. And then my biggest mentor in life, beyond my father-in-law, a guy named General Jack Galvin, who was eventually a 4-star as well, worked for him 3 times. He had it, and he had it all the way through the end. My father-in-law actually died earlier from a fall, but to watch General Galvin, this brilliant mind, truly extraordinary, was ultimately the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, great author, thinker, was the dean of the Fletcher School. He was a soldier, scholar, statesman. And to watch his mind be trapped in this increasingly incapable body was just extraordinarily painful and brutal. And so I'm quite concerned that at the very least, we start figuring out whether there is a real causal relationship between what we were inhaling. Because keep in mind, again, this was a war in which we went again and again and again. I think I spent, I don't know, depending on your counting rules, 5 years straight or in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then a lot more time out there as Central Command. So we need to get that data, and thankfully Congress did pass that, and now we're pushing to get this merged and to try to understand what it is, and obviously to determine then if there's something that can be done to try to mitigate the effects of what it is that we experienced.
We develop approaches toward China, toward the Middle East. What are the lessons of the last 20 years? What should we be keeping in mind?
Well, again, I think it's always really important to try to get the big ideas and distill those before you immediately jump to the policy for, say, Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or something like that. So I'll talk about that first if I could, and then if you want to come back to China. I think there are 5 big ideas or 5 big lessons that we should have learned from the last nearly 20 years of war with Islamist extremists. The first is that ungoverned or even inadequately governed spaces in the Muslim world, principally the greater Middle East, but there are other parts of the world where this holds as well, will be exploited by Islamist extremists. It's not a question of when, it's a question of if and how bad is it. The second is that you have to do something about this problem. You cannot study it until it goes away. It doesn't go away. And moreover, Las Vegas rules don't apply in these places. What happens there doesn't stay there. Rather, they tend to spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, which is bad enough, but all the way into our European allies' countries. If you look at the case of Syria, a geopolitical Chernobyl of a country, a meltdown where half the population has been displaced, half. Way over 500,000 Syrians killed. Half of that population been displaced is displaced outside the country, and millions, of course, went to Europe. And the effects of that were a catalyst for the greatest domestic political challenges that many of those countries have seen. Gave rise to ultra-right-wing nationalists, all kinds of issues, and political populism that has brought about an enormous amount of challenge, the greatest challenge, I think, to the countries of Europe since the end of the Cold War. Third is that in doing something, generally the U.S. has to lead. Our military capability is now so vastly more capable than all of the other countries put together. Keep in mind that when it comes to NATO, we don't just spend more than all of the other 27 NATO countries put together. We spend 2-point-something times as much as all of them put together. Now, that's not right, and this president and all the other presidents before him are right to say that our NATO partners, at the very least, should spend the 2% of GDP that they all committed to spending on defense at a variety of NATO summits over the years. But be that as it may, the reality, and soldiers have to sort of deal with reality. It's all nice to say this should be or that could be or what have you, but the reality is that our capabilities completely outstrip all the others put together, especially when it comes to the assets that are proven to be so incredibly helpful in enabling us to fight a completely different type of war. And mostly I'm talking about this constellation of drones, particularly the very high-flying, the Reaper was the Predator flown by the Air Force. They are of enormous value. We have over 60 orbits around the world of these. This isn't counting all the thousands of others that people throw into the air, launch into the air, all the other. These are the ones that are allocated by the Pentagon and then by combatant commanders like Central Command or the commanders in Iraq or Afghanistan. We have probably 6 times the number of orbits of all our possible allies and partners put together. That includes non-NATO partners like Australia that really matter. And not all of them will shoot from those platforms. They are hugely valuable, but a huge sub-bullet here on lesson number 3, and that is that even though we lead, we want a coalition. We want as many countries in that coalition as we possibly can, and we especially want Muslim countries, predominantly Islamic countries, in that coalition, keeping in mind that this is an existential struggle for those countries. Far more Muslims have been killed by Islamist extremists than have those of other faiths. Lesson number 4 is you have to acknowledge, you have to just accept a reality. You cannot counter terrorists like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda with just counter-terrorist force operations. In other words, you just can't drone strike or Delta Force raid your way out of this problem. You have to have a comprehensive approach. It has to be a comprehensive civil military campaign with all of the elements that Ambassador Crocker and I oversaw in Iraq. But, and here's the massive sub-bullet here, we don't want to do all of these. We don't want to have to do the fighting on the front lines. We're happy to advise, assist, enable, train, equip, and enabling is all of our assets and all the rest of that. But we want them to be fighting for their country. We don't want to have to do the political reconciliation, the restoration of basic services, the repair of damaged infrastructure, regalvanizing of local economies, schools, health clinics, all of which we had to do during the surge in Iraq, or that country was going to go up in smoke, but which now we can do through others and enable others with others. And that is crucial because of lesson number 5. And that is that we have to accept that this is not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. It is at least a generational struggle. And if you have a generational struggle and you have to stay committed, then you need a sustained commitment, but it has to be sustainable in terms of the commitment of blood and treasure. I would contend that 1,500 troops, which is what we had in Syria, is sustainable for the world's greatest military power. When you think that in Iraq alone, I was privileged to command 165,000 just American men and women in uniform, tens of thousands of others, and had even more contractors than all of those put together. In Afghanistan, 100,000 Americans with 50,000 NATO and non-NATO, and we're doing Afghanistan with under 20,000 total. Our contribution is still about 13,000, headed down to about 8,600 as a result of the deal that we have made. Again, I think that it is possible to have that kind of sustainable commitment because we have enduring national interests in these places. I've written twice on Afghanistan, cautioning and reminding people that we went there for a reason. That's where the 9/11 attacks were planned, when Al-Qaeda had a sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan when the Taliban ruled the country. And they have been fighting ever since to reestablish that sanctuary, and they have now been joined by the Islamic State in trying to do the same thing. We need to ensure that that is not reestablished. I mean, that's the main mission. It's also helpful to have a platform for counterterrorism operations in that region, even as we go about helping the countries in that region conduct a comprehensive approach and not just a narrow counterterrorism one, even if that it may end up being our principal focus and commitment. So again, I think if people agree to those, then the policy is pretty straightforward. And the question is, in a sense, how low can you go with our commitment of troops, and especially of blood, and our commitment when it comes to dollars of treasure? And if you can get that down to a sustainable level, then I think you have actually achieved what it is we should be trying to achieve, noting, and I'll actually come back to China, noting that the biggest of the big ideas in the world today is what the national security strategy and the national defense strategy describe as a resurgence of great power rivalries. That is the big issue of our day. By the way, let me state up front, I want to see the U.S.-China relationship, the most important relationship in the world, be as mutually beneficial as is absolutely possible. That is crucial, not just for our two countries, but for the entire world. And that's can only result from really serious strategic dialogue at the highest levels, understanding each other's absolute red lines, but also figuring out where we have common interests as well as competition. Keep in mind that this is a unique relationship. It certainly was not the case during the Cold War that we had any meaningful economic relationship with the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc countries. Whereas we are China's, or we were before the tariffs, we are each other's biggest trading partner and also each other's biggest strategic competitor. We have to figure out how it is that we can get along together and make sure that at times that we are firm but not provocative, but we do need to be firm at times, and that's a pretty important big idea as well.
I want to ask you one more thing, and then we have some questions. This is just my James Lipton Actors Studio question for you. Just to get a sense of your personality, I'm curious.
I hate to show my ignorance of whatever, but who's James Lipton?
The man was serving his country. James Lipton died recently. He was the host of the Actors Studio in New York, and he would always ask, people here could probably parrot the questions. He had a series of questions that were more personal. This is not one of those questions.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that.
So it doesn't really matter. But my question, my version of that is, I just like to ask, how would you craft your perfect day? You get a day off. What are the things? I know you've gotten to throw out the first ball at a World Series and flip the coin at the Super Bowl, but those were pretty good days. But yeah, if I throw any day at you, what are you out there doing? I don't think you're watching reality TV. So
no. Look, I travel so much because of the job, because of all the other events are still academic endeavors. There's boards. I'm on a couple of the boards of the companies that we own. Again, this
is a day you're not working.
So because of all that, and keeping in mind that I live in Arlington, Virginia, which is where our house is, but my office is in New York, I just want to be home. And honestly, I'm not somebody who wants to go to the country house or something like that on the weekend. There's nothing better than waking up at home on a Saturday or Sunday morning and, leisurely getting a cup of coffee and having breakfast and then, frankly, going through email and all the rest of that and catching up on work. And then there's a dog in the greater family there, stays with our daughter and son-in-law and 2-year-old granddaughter. That's another great arrival. But, to walk the dog and listen to podcasts, I think is heaven. The poor dog is so worn out by every visit that she has to our house. We had her this past weekend, and we'll deliver her back, and she can barely stagger up the steps. But no, that's truly enjoyable. And then to go out for dinner with my wife and friends, or go over to, again, our daughter and son-in-law's house or something like that. Or we have also a son who served 8 years in the Army, MIT graduate who's doing a JD MBA at Harvard. By the way, they've all just been sent home. Of course, as you may have seen, Princeton led the way, of course, in this, as always, in the Ivy League. And then Harvard and Yale followed. But I think all the students are not coming back for the rest of the semester. So we'll see how that transpires. And then he has a lovely wife who is an Afghan veteran as well. He did 3 or 4 tours. And she was a Harvard Rhodes Scholar, and then on her second startup. So there's a lot of wonderful things happening in the family, and just to have a chance to catch up on all that is really special.
Now, I'm just looking at the questions here, and there's one, I don't know who asked it, but it's certainly the one that this is the time and place to ask. What book most influenced or had the most profound effect on your personal life and your military life?
You know, there's a number of those over the years, and at different stages, different books, I think, influence you. And, you know, what influenced you as a second lieutenant may not be quite so significant to you as a four-star general. I will tell you, though, that the book that had an enormous impact on me during the surge of all times was a book called Grant Takes Command by Bruce Catton, one of the great Civil War historians. And to be truthful, prior to that time, I sort of subscribed to the historical treatment of Grant that I'd learned at West Point, and that persisted probably through the better part of the previous century. And that was that, you know, he did win the war, but of course that was inevitable. It was the North, the industrial might, and we were going to grind him down, and he was an attrition warfare general. And, you know, he just had, that was sort of the picture. Now I had a little bit more nuanced view than that. But reading that book as I was going through this extraordinarily difficult period, truly a grinding experience, was incredibly inspirational. Not to liken the Iraq War to the U.S. Civil War at all, but what Grant went through as he took command, and he did so, you know, at tactical level, operational, and then crafted the strategy. And, you know, the challenges of dealing with casualties, dealing with political influence, dealing with subordinates who sometimes didn't measure up. All the rest of this was enormously instructive. I might only get a few pages each night. The book would literally fall, you know, off. What happened, by the way, is somebody gave me the book, a historian at my previous assignment. I mean, said, thanks for that. You know, I'm sure I'll have a lot of time to read. It ended up in a rucksack. It ends up, and then enlisted aide put it by the bed, and I started going through it and was enthralled by it. But the experiences he had, and the way he dealt with them, you know, when you think of early on for him, Shiloh, after his initial successes as a one-star, a two-star, before he gets to Vicksburg, which is this extraordinary battle, so risky, that Sherman, his most trusted lieutenant, writes a letter and says, I want this in the official file that this is too risky. I mean, can you imagine somebody, your subordinate, doing that? And he still pressed on with it. But Shiloh was halfway there. And the forces under Grant and Sherman almost got driven back into the Tennessee River. They were surprised by the Confederates. It was probably his worst single day on a battlefield. And they're literally clinging to the edge of the riverbank. It's raining out. He's got his slouch hat on. There's no cover available for him because it's all being used as makeshift hospitals. He can hear the cries of soldiers who are having limbs amputated. He can hear cries of soldiers still on the battlefield to be recovered. Rain is dripping off his slouch hat. And he's just sitting on a chair doing what infantrymen sometimes do, which is waiting for the sun to come up the next day. And there's some with West Point hats here nodding, know what I'm talking about. And Sherman comes out of the dark and he sees Grant. Grant's got a cigar in his mouth, a little stub. He says, well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we? Grant says, yep. Lick 'em tomorrow, though. And we had some days like that in Iraq. And I actually recounted that story. And lick 'em tomorrow became a bit of, a rallying cry. You don't overuse that. But those images from that book were hugely important to me. And I became, by the way, an incredible admirer of Grant and feeling that the Southern historians had done a real terrible number on him during the first half, or maybe more than the first half of the previous century, trying to build up Robert E. Lee, the Southern cause, that there was some nobility to what was essentially fighting for slavery at the end of the day. And make no mistake about it, Grant beat Lee. Lee's job was quite straightforward. It was to keep the South in the war until the election of 1864 in the hope that someone other than Lincoln would win. Keep in mind, this was by no means a certainty. Up until really early in that year, there were draft riots in New York. Keep in mind that there was division Some wanted to leave, let the South go. And McClellan, who was running against Lincoln, ironically, had twice held the job that Grant then had, and miserable in each time, along with a number of other generals. It wasn't until he got to Grant that he finally found his general, with genius strategically as well as operationally and tactically. But Lee's job was to make sure that someone other than Lincoln, and he gambled on the final day of at Gettysburg, and it was, and then Grant divined the strategy that finally everything came together. Never before had there been a strategy for the war. He said, Sherman, you come out of Chattanooga, you take Atlanta, Savannah, and come up the coast. There were a couple of generals, fairly haplessly, but they were going to come out of the Tidewater area and pressure Lee, who was around Richmond. He had Sheridan go down the valley and secure that. That was the granary for the South. And then Meade, you go where Lee goes, and Grant sat in Meade's back pocket to make sure that he did. And it was a masterful strategy. Taking Atlanta probably meant that Lincoln would win. Taking the Shenandoah Valley definitely meant that he would. And that was the end of the war, really, because then it was the case that the North's might would certainly prevail over the Confederacy. But Grant was a genius. And again, look at the operational victory of Vicksburg, the risk that he took, and the rest of that. He had something very, very special. And people either actually have this on the battlefield or they don't. And he clearly did. And again, the demeanor that he had, he was someone who was incredibly civil to others, very soft-spoken, mild-mannered, and he could picture in time and in space, in his mind, and write orders. Because keep in mind, this isn't a day when you didn't have all the big staffs that I had making PowerPoint slides for me and, writing everything for me and all the rest of that. This is a day where you wrote your own orders. And he could do that, and it all came together in his mind. He could actually picture, and this is, of course, again, a battlefield that didn't have Google Maps and digital maps.
Have you thought about writing about, you could write through your lens something I couldn't, you'd have a different perspective about the decisions he made and how he did it.
Well, I actually I'm also on the Grant Monument Association board. Every single year, it started out, they wrote me in that they would interview me on Grant. Then I think we did that 2 years. I said, aren't you tired of me? Why don't I get somebody else? And we've subsequently had Ron Chernow, brilliant book on Grant, Ron White, who we'll do this year. Both interviewed both of them at multiple other locations, including West Point, 92nd Street Y, USC out on the West Coast. A brilliant professor up at West Point who wrote an annotated bibliography. So, no, but I haven't certainly wanted to put that down in that regard. But I even wrote, the New York Times contacted me one time and they said, who in our obituary list would you like to have lunch or dinner with? And I said, Ulysses S. Grant. I'd want to do it at the Lotus Club, it was founded by Mark Twain, who published Grant's memoirs and crafted the compensation scheme that was very advantageous to Grant's family. Keep in mind that he died before it was actually published. Lotus Club is right next to the final townhouse in which Grant lived on East 66th Street, right near Fifth Avenue. There's so many elements of that. And again, I think that would just be extraordinary.
Somebody has a question here that I think you'd want to get on the record for your own biography. It's kind of a tough question. What was the best surprise of your military decisions, I guess best outcome of your military decisions, and what was the worst or disappointment? What were the lessons you gleaned from that?
I guess, again, this is when folks ask, what are you most proud of, I guess. And it has to, I think, again, be the surge. Most folks had thought it was over, that we should just turn off the lights and come home, except, of course, you can't turn off the lights because there's a war going on over there. I mean, it used to grate on me a bit when subsequent leaders would say, we have ended the war in Iraq, and I wanted to raise my hand and say, excuse me, we haven't actually ended the war in Iraq. We've ended our involvement in the war in Iraq, and I fear we may have to come back because, again, what happens there doesn't stay there. And, of course, then you saw the rise of ISIS, and we had to go back in. So I think that clearly was. But I have to tell you again, this was not some, something where you're going around hitting high fives all the time. This is, again, as I said earlier, it was a grinding experience. In the final couple of days, I had a security chief warrant officer, a very senior guy, who'd been with me for a couple tours already, and he stayed with me for 2 more. And he oversaw that we had a pretty sizable security company, really. And we would, at times, every now and then, late at night, late for us was 10 or 10:30, because, if you're getting up at 5 every single day, by the way, you're never sleeping in. It's 7 days a week. It's always, but every now and then I'd go out and walk. There was this huge man-made lake at this enormous base in which we were located, made by Saddam, of course. And so just to think about that day and think about the next day, really. And I didn't want anybody else around. But you still have to have somebody with communications. You got to have, obviously, some security. So he'd trail along behind. Every now and then would chat, but not usually. But that night he said, sir, I just wonder if I could ask a question. He said, everybody said this was going to fail. You had people attacking you from every vantage point. It's been a very tough 19 months. But it succeeded. Again, your worst critics have had to acknowledge that now it was down by 85%, and it went down even further. What has it been like to command the surge? And I thought for a moment, and I said, Chief, it has been the most awesomely awesome of experiences on a good day. But there have been less than this many good days in 19 and a half months. So that certainly, I think, disappointments. We had a lot of very, very tough setbacks at various points. Some of these perhaps could be attributed to a decision you made. Some seemed almost like an act of God, such as when 2 helicopters collided when I was a 2-star. And we lost 17 soldiers in that single accident. And you just keep going back and how did this happen? Why were they doing what they did? But the result is there's 17 families that have just lost a son or father, or daughter, mother, and then many others that were badly burned. What was really extraordinary, I should share, was that those who were wounded, because you'd rush to the hospital, especially when you're a 2-star and you're very close to it. We had about 25,000 troops. Ultimately, 165,000. You're struggling just to get to all the memorial ceremonies, and there were a lot of those. But I remember going to the hospital when I was the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, and you'd sit with a soldier and talk to him, and there was one in particular who just really set me back, and I knew him quite well. He was a senior non-commissioned officer, a medical platoon sergeant, sort of famous guy. He was quite a capable, heroic guy, and he'd had a leg blown off, improvised explosive device attack. And so I was talking to him, and he said, but sir, and I let him call his wife. We had a cell phone, and we do that kind of stuff. There weren't that many of them in those days. And he said, hey, sir, but you know what? I've been worried about you. Worried about me? I said, yeah, you got a lot in your rucksack. You got a lot of rocks in your rucksack. And, I mean, this is, and then he said, and sir, I want to stay. I don't want to go home. We can deal with this. I can just monitor the radio. I said, Toon Sergeant, you got to get home. We were able, though, to get him able to stay in the Army. And he actually ended up creating a combat medics course at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, our home base, where we incorporated all the lessons learned on those battlefields. And this is different than we'd ever encountered before. Again, the proliferation of improvised explosive device, suicide bombers, and so forth. So, a real hero. And I guess that, I just want to be sure that you realize how extraordinary these individuals are. I talk about those who volunteered after 9/11, knowing that they're going to go to combat, very likely, as America's new greatest generation. And I really mean that. I think they're truly exceptional. And to have 1,215 of them re-enlist in a combat zone, knowing that they're going to go to combat again, because this is the height of our involvement still, and they could sense we're already starting to shift to Afghanistan. Again, it's sort of hard to put that into words. And, you going through your mind, I could only explain it that, number one, everybody in that place felt privileged to perform a mission that's larger than self. Number two, you feel privileged to do it with the others who are around you. And then number three, there's a keen awareness that the American public, regardless of whether it agrees with the policies we are implementing or not, is appreciative of those who are sacrificing and also their families. I remember we commissioned our son. I happened to be home at that time. We went up to Boston, commissioned him and all of his ROTC classmates and so forth, and we're driving away, and there's a huge sign over the road on a bridge, and it says, "Hate the war, love the troops." And I turned to my wife and I said, 50% ain't bad. And I think they got the 50% right.
I know we've run out of time. I do want to make sure I ask you this, though, and I'm not asking because it's a presidential year, but what's next for you?
Well, look, I'd like to keep doing what I'm doing for as long as I can. I actually mean it. Again, intellectual stimulation, I think, is what people want. I mean, why in the world are all these people here risking coronavirus to hear some old soldier? So I think that it truly is. I feel very, very fortunate to have ended up where I am with the portfolio of activities that I have, that, these private equity guys took a flyer on some old soldier turned spy master. And, it's, I guess, nice to be sufficiently relevant still that, folks in State Department, White House, Pentagon, and Capitol Hill still occasionally want to know what you think about things. And so that's, so you can still contribute, even if you're not in uniform or not in one of the departments. And I'm grateful for that opportunity as well. I might end, in fact, I'm a huge admirer of Henry Kissinger. And he has been a mentor to me for quite a long time, actually. I mean, every single time I would go to New York, I would get an audience with him if we could, and it started way back when I was either a 2- or 3-star general. So he, very early, where I wasn't all that significant, he would invite us in. And I remember one time he invited my wife, and by then I was the CIA director, and we were going to be up in New York, and I think he heard, and he said, "We've been wanting to host a dinner for you and your wife, and Nancy and I will get a few friends around, and if you'd do us the honor." And I'd actually been wanting to do that because I wanted to present, there's a certain medal that only the director can present. It's not for spying, it's for actually just being an intellectual sounding board, frankly. I mean, there's nobody in America who's gone to China every single year since the 1970s and still does it at least once and often twice a year. I remember sitting with him, and it was a wonderful evening, and I noticed that he'd had maybe even more than one glass of wine. He's very disciplined normally. But, he'd just had a medal, and we're having a great time. It's a stimulating conversation. I turned to him and I said, sort of privately, "Henry, what is it?" He was in his late 80s by then. I said, "What is it that worries you most personally? Now, personally, what is it that worries you?" And he turned to me and he said, "Irrelevance." And he's on to something. And he's now in his mid-90s, and by God, he's still traveling to China. He is still sharing his thoughts, and a truly remarkable individual, and a great role model in that regard. And to be he truly is a senior statesman, but to be a minor senior statesman would be a pretty good fate.
Well, thank you for stimulating this audience. I know they appreciate it.